In the hallowed halls of Blackwood Law, Miles Davies' brilliant mind was silenced by a crippling stutter. The courtroom was his tomb, every spoken word a battle lost. But what if his true voice lay not in speech, but in the devastating, undeniable power of the written word? The silence in the moot courtroom of Blackwood School of Law was a physical weight. For Miles Davies, it was a tomb. He stood at the polished oak lectern, the expectant faces of his classmates blurring into a single, judgmental gaze. Dominating them all was the flinty stare of Mrs. Harrington, his torts eye professor, a woman who seemed to find a personal offense in mediocrity. The arguments, pristine and irrefutable, spiraled in his mind. Res ipsa loquitur asterisk, the nuances of proximate cause. The elegant precedent set in Palsgraf v. Long Island Railroad Co. They were all there. A perfectly constructed fortress of logic he had spent weeks building. But the bridge between his brain and his mouth was a collapsed, treacherous ruin. He opened his mouth to begin his final oral argument. What emerged was not a sentence, but a choked, percussive CCC that died in his throat, strangled by the seizing muscles in his jaw. A hot flush of shame crept up his neck, burning his ears. He tried again, forcing air past a larynx that felt like a clenched fist. The silence stretched, growing heavier with each failed attempt. He could hear a pen scratching, a muffled cough. He saw pity in one classmate's eyes and in another's, thinly veiled impatience. It was a familiar, agonizing symphony that had defined his 24 years of life. But here, in the arena he had dreamed of conquering since he was a boy, it was unbearable. "That will be all, Mr. Davies." Mrs. Harrington's voice was devoid of emotion, a clinical pronouncement of his failure. Her pen made a single, sharp scratch on her notepad. A failing grade, of course. He didn't hear the whispers that followed him as he fled the courtroom, but he felt them like a swarm of hornets at his back. It wasn't the failure itself that crushed him. He was accustomed to that. It was the public, undeniable confirmation of a terrifying truth he had been fighting for months. He didn't belong here. His brilliant mind was a prisoner in a broken vessel. As he walked past the grand portraits of esteemed alumni, his path didn't lead to the library, but toward the registrar's office. He was going to ask for the withdrawal forms. He didn't go to the registrar. Instead, he retreated to the one place on campus where silence was a virtue, the hushed cathedral of the law library. In its labyrinthine stacks, surrounded by the quiet, dusty wisdom of centuries, Miles could almost breathe. The cacophony of his failure faded, replaced by the gentle rustle of turning pages. There was only one class that didn't feel like a weekly humiliation: jurisprudence. It was taught by Professor Alastair Finley, a man who was as much a part of Blackwood's architecture as the ivy on its walls. At 70-something, with a shock of white hair and eyes that seemed to see right through flimsy arguments, Finley was a relic from an era when law was considered a philosophy first and a profession second. His Socratic method was legendary and terrifying to most students, who dreaded being called upon to defend their half-formed opinions. But Miles loved it. He could follow the intricate dance of logic in his head, appreciating the beauty of the intellectual chase without the pressure of a verbal performance. Late one Tuesday, Professor Finley assigned an optional, extra-credit essay. It was not a simple task. The topic was the en right servitude paradox, a knot of legal theory from 1892 so tangled and obscure that it was now little more than a historical footnote, a puzzle for academic show-offs. Most of the class mentally discarded it the moment it was mentioned. For Miles, it was a life raft. He claimed a secluded carrel in the library's deepest corner and began to work. For 2 weeks, the world outside that small pool of lamplight ceased to exist. He barely ate, fueled by vending machine coffee and a desperate, burning need. The research was a descent into a forgotten world of convoluted deeds and contradictory precedents. And as he began to write, something miraculous happened. The dam of his silence broke, not into a spoken trickle, but a deluge of ink. All the arguments that had been trapped behind his teeth, All the eloquent phrases that had died in his throat now flowed onto the page with breathtaking clarity and force. Each sentence was a perfectly articulated thought, each paragraph a structured argument he could never voice. He wasn't just answering a prompt. He was channeling his entire being onto the paper. When he finally printed the last page, he was hollowed out and exhausted. Before him lay a 40-page document, a meticulous and passionate dissection of the paradox. It was more than an essay. It was the sound of his own voice. Professor Finley sat in his office late on a Thursday evening, the air thick with the scent of old books and pipe tobacco. He was grading, a task he increasingly found to be an exercise in managed disappointment. He just finished a stack of essays that were, at best, competent recitations of his lectures. They were serviceable, passionless, and utterly forgettable. He sighed, picking up the next paper from the pile. It was unusually thick. Davies Miles. He remembered the boy, quiet, sat in the back, never spoke a word, not even when prodded. Finley had initially pegged him as another coaster, someone just trying to get through the semester unnoticed. He began to read, his pen poised to make its usual sharp, critical marks. After the first page, the pen lay still. By the third, he had sat up straighter, his bushy white eyebrows knitting together. He read the introduction again. The thesis was audacious, a complete recontextualization of the Enright paradox that Finley himself had never considered. It was either brilliant or the work of a lunatic. He kept reading. The logic was a steel trap, each premise building on the last with an unforgiving precision. The prose was not merely clear. It was muscular, elegant, and at times, almost lyrical in its intellectual ferocity. The citations were impeccable, drawing from sources so deep in the archives Finley doubted any other student even knew they existed. A flicker of suspicion, a reflex honed by decades of dealing with students, ignited in his mind. This is too good. He swiveled in his leather chair, opened his laptop, and ran the entire 40-page document through the university's most rigorous plagiarism detection software. He waited, a frown etched on his face. The results came back, 99.7% original. The remaining 0.3 were properly quoted legal statutes. The suspicion vanished, replaced by a feeling he hadn't experienced in years, pure, unadulterated astonishment. This wasn't a student paper. This was a work of profound legal scholarship. It was a silent, devastatingly effective argument that didn't just answer the question, but redefined it entirely. He stared at the name on the cover page again. Miles Davies, the quiet boy in the back, the one who couldn't speak. Finley leaned back, a slow smile spreading across his face. It was the smile of a prospector who, after sifting through tons of river mud, had just found a solid gold nugget. He turned back to his computer and typed a short, unambiguous email. Mr. Davies, my office, 3 p.m. tomorrow. The walk to Professor Finley's office was the longest of Miles's life. Each footstep echoed on the marble floors of the hallway like a drumbeat counting down to his execution. The email had been a terse command, devoid of any warmth or context. He replayed every possible scenario in his head, each one more mortifying than the last. He was going to be accused of academic fraud. The paper was so far beyond his usual performance that the only logical conclusion was that he'd cheated. He imagined the disciplinary hearing, the disgrace, the final, humiliating end to his already doomed legal career. He tapped on the heavy oak door, his knuckles barely making a sound. "Enter," a gruff voice called out. Finley's office was a controlled explosion of intellect. Books weren't just on shelves. They were in precarious towers on the floor, in open-faced stacks on his desk, spilling from armchairs. The air smelled of aged paper and something faintly sweet, like cherry tobacco. The professor himself was seated behind a massive mahogany desk, Miles's 40-page essay sitting alone in the center, looking like a piece of evidence. "Mr. Davies," Finley said, his eyes sharp and unreadable. He gestured to the worn leather chair opposite him. Miles sat, his spine rigid. Finley didn't waste time with pleasantries. He tapped a single, manicured finger on the third section of the paper. Your argument here, regarding the implied easement of necessity as a counter to the perpetuity clause. Elaborate. The request was a bucket of ice water. Panic flared, cold and sharp. This was it. The test. He had to speak to defend the work that had poured out of him so effortlessly. He opened his mouth. I be believed. The word caught a fishhook in his throat. He squeezed his eyes shut in frustration, the familiar heat of shame rising. He waited for the sigh of impatience, the curt dismissal. But it didn't come. There was only silence. When he dared to open his eyes, Professor Finley was simply watching him, his expression not of annoyance, but of intense, unwavering focus. Take your time, son, Finley said, his voice surprisingly gentle. Then he did something unexpected. He pushed the paper forward with his fingertips. It's all right, he said, his gaze shifting from Miles to the document. He tapped it again, this time with reverence. This has a voice, a very loud, very clear one. Miles stared, uncomprehending. For 50 years, Finley continued, leaning back in his chair, I have listened to students who can talk. They can weave beautiful, intricate sentences that sound impressive and mean absolutely nothing. They build houses of cards with their eloquence. I have been waiting, Mr. Davies, for an architect, someone who builds with steel and stone, on a foundation of unshakable logic. He leaned forward again, his eyes locking onto Miles's. This, he said, his voice low and resonant, is a fortress. I haven't seen a mind like this on paper since I was a student myself. I don't care if you have to write your arguments on a napkin. The quality of the thought is what matters. A single, hot tear escaped Miles's eye and traced a path down his cheek. It wasn't a tear of sadness or shame, but of a profound, shattering relief. The fortress he had built wasn't just his paper. It was the wall around his own mind, and this old man had just walked through the gate and admired the architecture inside. For the first time in his life, Miles Davies felt not just heard, but understood. Professor Finley let the moment hang in the air, allowing the weight of his words to settle. Then he reached into a drawer and pulled out a thick, navy blue binder, placing it on the desk with a soft thud. It had an air of importance, of something set aside for a special purpose. There are different kinds of battlefields in law, Mr. Davies, Finley began, his tone shifting from philosophical to practical. The courtroom is only one of them, the most sensational, perhaps, but not always the most decisive. Many wars are won long before a lawyer ever stands to speak, won in the silent, brutal arena of the written word. He slid the binder across the desk. On the cover, embossed in gold leaf, were the words, "The Phineas Clark Prize for Written Advocacy." It's a national competition, Finley explained. Older than the American Bar Association, but not as flashy as the big moot court tournaments. The grandstanders and the silver-tongued orators have no interest in it. Why? Because it's entirely anonymous. The judges receive only a number and a written brief. They don't know your name, your school, or whether you can charm a jury. They judge one thing and one thing only, the quality of the argument on the page. Miles stared at the binder as if it were a holy text, a stage where his disability was not a handicap, but completely irrelevant. It was a possibility so perfectly suited to his existence that he had never dared to imagine it. The deadline for entry has passed, Finley said, anticipating the question in Miles's eyes. However, the chairman of the judging committee is an old friend, a man who, like me, appreciates substance over style. I called him this morning after reading your paper. I told him I had a candidate whose work demanded consideration. He opened the binder. Inside was a massive case file, hundreds of pages detailing a complex corporate liability dispute. It was dense, intimidating, and beautiful. I have secured you a spot, Finley said, his voice firm. But that is all I will do. I will not help you write a single sentence. I will not give you a single argument. He leaned forward, and for the first time, Miles saw a glint of the fierce mentor behind the quiet academic. But I will be your most ruthless adversary. I will read your drafts and I will tear them to shreds. I will attack your premises, question your precedents, and challenge every conclusion until what is left is not just good, but unimpeachable, indestructible. It wasn't an offer of help. It was a challenge. It was the forging of a weapon, offered not out of pity, but out of a profound respect for the raw material he saw. Miles looked from the case file to the professor's unwavering gaze, and for the first time since he'd stepped on campus, he felt a surge of power, not despair. He couldn't speak the word, but he gave a single, decisive nod. The apprenticeship had begun. The next month was a blur of ink and intensity. Miles's world shrank to the dimensions of the case file, and the path between his small apartment and Professor Finley's office. He lived and breathed the intricate details of Asterisk Apex, Manufacturing V, Sterling Environmental Asterisk. He fell asleep thinking about liability clauses and woke up with fresh counterarguments scribbled on a notepad by his bed. Finley's office became his sanctuary and his crucible. Their sessions were grueling, silent battles. Miles would arrive with a new draft, his hands stained with ink, and slide it across the desk. Finley would read, his face an impassive mask, his red pen hovering like a bird of prey. Then it would descend. He was merciless. He circled entire paragraphs with a curt "weak." He drew jagged lines through carefully constructed sentences, scrawling unsupported assertion or logical leap in the margins. He didn't offer solutions. He only exposed flaws. After each session, Miles would leave with a draft that looked like it had bled to death, his heart sinking. But back in the library, a strange thing would happen. The criticism wasn't demoralizing. It was clarifying. Each red mark was a signpost, pointing him toward a stronger, tighter, more defensible position. He wasn't just writing, he was forging. He rebuilt his arguments from the ground up, finding better precedents, sealing logical gaps Finley had exposed. He felt his mind stretching, becoming sharper and more disciplined than he ever thought possible. He was no longer just a student. He was a craftsman, and Professor Finley was the master smith, holding his work to the fire until only the purest steel remained. On the final day, Miles worked for 18 straight hours, refining the conclusion until it shone with an undeniable diamond-hard clarity. He assembled the final brief, his hands trembling slightly, not from fear, but from a mixture of exhaustion and exhilaration. He walked to the submission office and handed over the envelope just 1 minute before the 5 p.m. deadline. The 6 weeks that followed were a unique form of torture. The silence returned, but now it was filled with a humming, anxious anticipation. He went to his other classes, he took his exams, but his mind was elsewhere, waiting. He checked his email a dozen times a day, his heart lurching at every new message. Then, on a dreary Tuesday afternoon, it arrived. The subject line was simple: Phineas Clark Prize Decision. He stared at it for a full minute, his breath caught in his chest. He clicked it open. His eyes scanned past the formal salutation, landing on the first sentence. Dear Mr. Davies, it is with great pleasure that we inform you that your submission, 73 billion, has been awarded first place in this year's Phineas Clark Prize for Written Advocacy. He read it again and again. The words seemed to shimmer on the screen. He scrolled down, his vision blurred by sudden tears, to the attached judge's commentary. There were paragraphs of praise for the brief structure, its originality, its compelling force. But it was the final comment that made him gasp. It was from Eleanor Vance, a senior partner at Covington and Croft, one of the most prestigious law firms in the country. Her comment was short and definitive. Brief 73 billion is, without exaggeration, the most masterfully crafted and persuasive piece of legal writing I have read in the last decade. It is a work of art. The day after the email, Miles's phone rang. The number was unfamiliar, with a Manhattan area code. He hesitated, his usual aversion to phone calls warring with a new, tentative curiosity. He answered but said nothing. "Am I speaking with Miles Davies?" a woman's voice asked. It was crisp and professional, yet carried an undercurrent of warmth. Miles managed a quiet, affirmative "This is Eleanor Vance from Covington and Croft. I was on the judging panel for the Phineas Clark Prize." Miles's grip on the phone tightened. "Mr. Davies," she continued, her tone direct, "your brief speaks for itself." Loudly. "At our firm we have a division, the Appellate and Written Strategy Group. It's the engine room. It's where we win our most complex cases before they ever see a courtroom. We believe that is your battlefield." There was a brief pause, filled not with expectation for a reply, but with the weight of conviction. "A formal offer letter is on its way to you via courier. We want you to start this summer." The world tilted on its axis. A job offer from Covington and Croft. Not an interview, not a request for a transcript, but a direct, unequivocal offer based purely on the strength of his mind as it existed on paper. Later that afternoon, he found himself standing once more outside Professor Finley's office. He knocked, and entered to find the professor exactly as he always was, surrounded by his fortress of books. Miles walked to the desk. He took a deep, steadying breath, marshaling all his focus, practicing the words he had rehearsed 100 times in his head. "Professor," he said, the word coming out slowly but perfectly formed. "Thank you." A rare, genuine smile touched the corners of Finley's mouth, crinkling the skin around his eyes. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod of acknowledgement. He then reached into the bottom drawer of his desk, the one Miles had never seen him open, and retrieved a long, slender velvet box. It was worn with age. He pushed it across the desk. "The right tool," he said simply, "for the right hand." Miles opened it. Nestled inside the faded lining was a beautiful, vintage Montblanc fountain pen, its black resin gleaming under the lamplight, the gold nib perfectly preserved. It was heavy, elegant, and felt impossibly right in his hand. He looked up at Finley, his throat too thick with emotion to even attempt another word. The professor just looked at him, his expression one of deep, quiet satisfaction. He had not cured Miles's stutter. He had simply shown him that it did not matter. He had given him more than a prize or a job. He had given him a language and with it a future. Holding the pen, feeling its solid, reassuring weight, Miles Davies understood. His voice was finally free.